Breaking. The British government just weaponised your passport, and they're coming for yours next. In a move so shocking it sounds like fiction, Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood just announced Britain will block visas from entire countries if those nations refuse to take back their failed asylum seekers. Not some countries, not problem countries. Any country that doesn't play ball. This isn't diplomacy. This is economic hostage-taking on a global scale, and what I'm about to reveal will show you exactly how deep this rabbit hole goes. Hit that subscribe button now because this story is about to explode internationally, and you need to understand what's coming before it hits. Here's the bombshell they buried in diplomatic language. The UK just activated dormant powers from 2022 that can shut down visa access for millions of people worldwide. Business visas, tourist visas, student visas, family reunion visas, everything gets cut off if your government doesn't cooperate with British deportation demands. But this gets infinitely worse. This isn't just Britain acting alone. The Five Eyes Alliance, the UK, United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are coordinating this together. That means if Britain blocks your country's visas, potentially all 5 nations will follow suit simultaneously. Think about what that actually means. Getting locked out of the 5 most desirable English-speaking destinations on Earth because your president won't sign deportation papers fast enough. That's not immigration policy. That's economic warfare disguised as bureaucracy. Mahmood announced this during a classified Five Eyes intelligence meeting in London. Why classified? Because they're essentially creating an international blackmail system. Cooperate with our deportations or watch your citizens get locked out of the Western world's biggest economies. The timing of this announcement is absolutely crucial, and here's what mainstream media won't tell you. Mahmood only became Home Secretary 8 days ago. 8 days. She replaced Yvette Cooper, who got quietly demoted because Labour's immigration strategy was falling apart in real time. So picture this. A brand new Home Secretary walks into the job, sees the immigration crisis spiralling out of control, and her first instinct is to threaten economic warfare against potentially dozens of countries. That's not confidence. That's panic masquerading as tough leadership. But here's the twist that exposes the staggering hypocrisy at the heart of British politics. These visa sanction powers, they were created by Conservative Home Secretary Priti Patel in 2022 under the Nationality and Borders Act. Labour politicians literally stood in Parliament and called these powers barbaric, counterproductive, and an attack on innocent civilians. Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper, yes, the same Cooper who just got demoted, called visa sanctions cruel collective punishment that violates basic principles of justice. Labour MP Diane Abbott said they represented diplomatic thuggery that would damage Britain's international reputation. Now they're not just using these powers, they're expanding them through Five Eyes coordination. They're making the barbaric policy even more aggressive. The party that spent 3 years condemning Conservative immigration cruelty is now implementing identical measures with international backing. Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp is absolutely savaging them for this hypocrisy. He's basically standing in Parliament saying, "We created these tools 3 years ago, you called us monsters for it, and now you're using them exactly as we intended." It's political revenge at its most brutal. But here's what makes this truly insane. The Conservative Party, the party that literally created these visa sanction powers, never actually used them. Even under Priti Patel, even during the worst periods of the small boat crisis, even when they were getting hammered in polls for being too weak on immigration, they kept these powers in reserve. So why is Labour, the supposedly more diplomatic and humanitarian party, immediately reaching for the most aggressive option available? Because they're absolutely terrified of the situation they've inherited. Let me show you exactly why they're panicking. The small boat crisis has exploded beyond anything Britain has ever experienced. Over 30,000 crossings this year already. That's a 37% increase from 2023. Last Saturday alone saw 1,143 arrivals in a single day. The previous record was 1,295 in November 2022. But here's the number that's really driving this desperation. The UK is currently spending £8.2 million per day housing asylum seekers in hotels. Per day. That's almost £3 billion annually just on temporary accommodation. The Treasury is hemorrhaging money at an unsustainable rate, and every cabinet minister knows it. The hotel costs are so enormous, they're actually distorting other government spending. The Department for Education can't fund school repairs because the Home Office is burning through billions on asylum accommodation. The NHS is struggling with budget allocations because immigration costs are consuming resources faster than they can be allocated. This financial crisis is what's really driving the visa threat policy. When you're spending £3 billion annually on a problem that keeps getting worse, desperate governments start threatening desperate measures. But wait, it gets so much worse. Remember RAF Scampton, the historic airbase where the legendary Dambusters Squadron trained during World War II? Labour made scrapping its use as asylum accommodation a major campaign promise. They called it poor value for money, disrespectful to our heritage, and inhumane detention. Guess what's back on the table? Not just Scampton, but potentially dozens of military installations across Britain. Defence Minister Luke Pollard quietly confirmed they're reviewing all available military sites for emergency accommodation use. That's political speak for we're reopening everything we swore we'd never touch. The Conservative government spent £51 million converting Scampton before Labour cancelled the project. Now they're essentially admitting the Tories might have been right all along. That's not just policy reversal. That's £51 million of taxpayer money wasted on political point scoring. Think about this transformation. 6 months ago, Labour was calling Conservative immigration policies cruel, counterproductive, and contrary to British values. They promised humane, efficient, and evidence-based solutions. They mocked Tory tough talk and failed gimmicks. Now they're using Conservative visa sanction powers, reopening Conservative military detention centres, and coordinating Conservative-style policies with international allies. They've become everything they criticised, just with better PR and more institutional support. Here's what nobody in mainstream media is asking. What happens when countries retaliate? If Britain starts blocking visas, those countries will inevitably respond with reciprocal measures. British citizens will find themselves locked out of business opportunities, educational exchanges, tourism destinations, and family visits. The economic consequences could be absolutely devastating. British companies that rely on international partnerships could find themselves excluded from entire markets overnight. Universities could lose lucrative international student revenue. Tourism operators could see bookings collapse as reciprocal visa restrictions kick in. But the retaliation won't stop at visas. Countries facing economic pressure often respond by restricting trade relationships, cancelling diplomatic agreements, and withdrawing cooperation on security issues. Britain could find itself increasingly isolated from the international community over a domestic policy crisis. This isn't just about immigration anymore. This is about Britain potentially sacrificing decades of carefully built international relationships because the Home Office can't process asylum claims efficiently. We're watching domestic policy failures drive foreign policy disasters. The Five Eyes coordination makes the potential consequences exponentially worse. If all 5 countries implement coordinated visa restrictions, they're essentially creating an economic exclusion zone against non-compliant nations. That's not immigration management, that's geopolitical pressure that could fundamentally reshape international relations. Think about the precedent this sets. If visa systems can be weaponized against countries that don't cooperate on immigration, what stops them from being used against nations that won't comply on trade disputes, political disagreements, or security concerns? Once you normalize economic coercion through visa restrictions, where does it end? But here's the most dangerous aspect of this policy. Countries don't fail to cooperate on deportations out of spite. They fail because of genuine logistical, political, and capacity constraints. Political instability makes it unsafe to return people. Bureaucratic dysfunction means paperwork can't be processed efficiently. Resource limitations mean governments literally can't handle additional deportation logistics. Threatening economic consequences won't fix any of these underlying problems. If anything, it'll make cooperation less likely by creating adversarial relationships where collaborative ones are needed most. Consider this scenario. A country facing civil unrest can't safely process deportation returns. Britain responds by blocking visas, devastating that nation's economy and making political instability worse. Does that make deportation cooperation more likely or less likely? The policy could actively worsen the problems it's designed to solve. Mahmoud knows she has maybe 6 months to show dramatic improvement before she faces the same fate as Cooper. That desperation is driving increasingly extreme policy positions. But desperation rarely produces effective solutions. Here's what's particularly revealing about Labour's approach. During the election campaign, they promised evidence-based immigration policy guided by expert analysis and international best practices. They criticised Conservative knee-jerk reactions and counterproductive tough talk. Now they're implementing the most aggressive immigration policy tools available without any evidence they'll actually work. There's no pilot programme, no limited trial, no careful assessment of consequences. They're going straight to economic threats against potentially dozens of countries. The irony would be hilarious if the consequences weren't so serious. The party that spent years lecturing Conservatives about the importance of measured, thoughtful policymaking is now threatening international economic warfare as their opening move. But here's what makes this policy particularly cruel. It fundamentally punishes ordinary citizens for their government's failures or limitations. Imagine being a small business owner trying to secure British contracts, only to discover your visa application is automatically rejected because your president won't cooperate on deportation logistics. That's collective punishment with a bureaucratic face. It violates every principle Labour claimed to represent during their campaign for more humane immigration policy. The visa threat policy also reveals the complete breakdown of traditional diplomatic cooperation. Normal immigration management relies on mutual benefit, shared responsibility, and collaborative problem-solving. When governments resort to economic coercion, they've essentially admitted that cooperative approaches have failed entirely. This represents a fundamental shift from partnership-based international relations to coercion-based power politics. That's not just a change in immigration policy. That's a transformation in how Britain relates to the entire international community. What's particularly chilling is how quickly this escalation happened. 8 days ago, Cooper was still Home Secretary pursuing traditional diplomatic engagement. Today, her replacement is threatening economic warfare against non-compliant nations. The speed of this policy shift suggests panic-driven decision-making rather than strategic planning. And if this policy backfires spectacularly, if countries retaliate with reciprocal restrictions that damage British interests more than they help with deportations, Mahmoud will likely face the same fate as Cooper, leaving the next Home Secretary with even fewer diplomatic options and more damaged international relationships. The real question isn't whether visa sanctions will solve Britain's immigration crisis. Based on the track record of every immigration policy over the past 15 years, they probably won't. The real question is whether Britain can afford the international consequences when this policy inevitably fails. We could be watching the beginning of Britain's systematic isolation from the international community over a domestic crisis that no government has successfully managed. The immigration problem isn't getting solved. It's just creating additional foreign policy disasters. Here's what's coming next. If visa sanctions don't produce immediate results, and they won't, the pressure will mount for even more aggressive measures. Economic sanctions, trade restrictions, diplomatic isolation. Each escalation will make cooperation less likely while damaging Britain's international standing further. The Five Eyes coordination adds another layer of complexity and danger. These 5 nations have different legal systems, different electoral pressures, different relationships with potential target countries. What happens when Canada decides the policy isn't working? When Australia faces serious economic retaliation? When New Zealand's tourism industry gets devastated by reciprocal restrictions? The alliance could fracture over immigration policy, potentially weakening decades of intelligence sharing and security cooperation. Britain could find itself isolated not just from target countries, but from its closest allies as well. So there you have it. Britain's latest immigration strategy involves threatening economic warfare against potentially dozens of countries while reopening military detention centres they promise never to use again. It's desperation disguised as decisiveness, hypocrisy wrapped in tough rhetoric, and potentially the most dangerous foreign policy gamble since Brexit. This isn't about stopping small boats anymore. This is about Britain's willingness to sacrifice international relationships, economic partnerships, and diplomatic credibility in what's likely a doomed attempt to solve an inherently unsolvable problem. The consequences could define Britain's place in the world for decades. What do you think? Is this brilliant diplomatic hardball or catastrophic overreach that'll leave Britain more isolated than ever? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let me know if you want deeper analysis of the policies mainstream media won't properly explain. Because trust me, there's much more coming as this story develops. Hit that notification bell because British politics just entered uncharted territory. International relations are about to get extremely messy, and I'll be here to decode every development as this potential diplomatic disaster unfolds on the global stage.